Thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you. Late in his life, the great American diplomat, philosopher, scientist, printer, and politician, Benjamin Franklin, as he was writing a letter to his friend, contemplating his own mortality, penned the immortal phrase, "In life, nothing can be said to be certain, save death and taxes." I like to think of them, the old man penning those words, contemplating the inevitability of his own demise. Of course, he was wrong, completely wrong. So the research we now have from economics shows that taxes are completely avoidable, and death, it turns out, might also be avoidable, at least temporarily. So in the 1970s, the Australian government announced that it was going to abolish inheritance tax. All you needed to do was live to a certain date. If I remember rightly, it was the 1st of January 1979. And you would pay no inheritance tax. Now, you've got to say that's an incentive, right? So 2 Australian economists, Andrew Leigh and Joshua Gans, studied the death records. And it turns out that, curiously, as the date of the tax's abolition crept closer and closer, the death rate in Australia started to fall. People were managing to hold on in order to avoid taxes. And then, as the inheritance tax was abolished, the death rate suddenly spiked. And their estimate is that approximately half the people who would have died in the 2 weeks before the tax were able to postpone their deaths, or possibly when their deaths were recorded, we're not quite sure which, in order to have a more tax-efficient arrangement of their affairs. So death, temporarily avoidable. Taxes, at least inheritance taxes, permanently avoidable. In fact, Joshua Gans and Andrew Leigh did a follow-up study of another announcement in Australia of that a baby bonus would be paid to any family who had a child on or after the 1st of July 2003. It was announced in the May, so 6 weeks in advance. So a baby bonus. Interesting. So it was about 3,000 Australian dollars. Now, that's a nice plasma TV. You've got to admit, that counts as an incentive. All you need to do is hang on until the 1st of July to have your baby. And a very strange thing happened when Gans and Leigh began to examine the birth statistics in Australia. So they started to fall in late June. And by the 30th of June 2003, the birth rate had just absolutely collapsed. And then the next day, it literally more than doubled. 1st of July 2003, I think to this day, the highest number of babies born in Australia. So it turns out that in response to tax incentives, both the date of our births and the date of our deaths can be optimized. So I say all this because as an economist, I've been asked to talk about behavior change. And of course, one of the most straightforward ways to shape people's behavior is through the price system. If something is more expensive, people consume less. If something is cheaper, people will consume more. And that is straightforward. And I think amidst all the excitement about behavioral science and behavioral economics, we shouldn't forget that. That's really fundamental. But there are, of course, other things going on. So people respond to incentives, but they don't just respond to incentives. So Bob Cialdini, famous social psychologist, one of his key ideas is the idea of social proof. So people like to do what other people are doing. So if you want people to not drop litter, you don't say, we have a real problem with litter around here, everyone's dropping litter all the time, because then people will say, well, if everyone's dropping litter, I might as well drop litter. Instead, you have a message along the lines of, everybody else is picking up their litter and taking it home, so please do likewise. And Cialdini has some interesting research specifically in saving energy. So when you send people messages along the lines of, other guests in this hotel room are saving on energy, or other people in your street are doing their best to save energy, people respond strongly to that. There's no incentive there. There's no economic incentive whatsoever. People are just wanting to do what their neighbours, what their peers are doing. Social proof, terribly important. But then, if I can complicate the message still further, so people respond to incentives. People don't just respond to incentives, they respond to other things. Sometimes it can be quite complicated to figure out what people are going to respond to. So David Halpern will be talking to you in a few minutes. His team they've done many, many experiments. One experiment they did was trying to get people to sign up to the organ donor registry. And they tried a whole bunch of different messages. What sort of things can you tell people to try to persuade them to sign up? And because it turns out we don't pay people to be organ donors. That apparently for some reason that's regarded as unacceptable. I'm hazy about why. So instead we have to use behavioural science. We have to persuade them. So some of the techniques that we used involved this idea of social proof. Other people are signing up for the organ donor registry. Why not join them? And there were a variety of these messages tried. Turns out they weren't especially successful. David was telling me about all the details, but they weren't particularly successful. Possibly because people took the view, well, if other people are donating their organs, you don't need mine. And the message that worked incredibly well was what tends to be called the reciprocity message. Reciprocity, would that be the way, the reciprocity message? I call it the passive-aggressive message, personally, which is, if you wanted an organ, wouldn't you want someone to have donated? If you needed a kidney, wouldn't you want someone to have donated a kidney? It's like, think about it. And then you go, well, yes. If I was sick and I needed a kidney, I would want somebody else to have donated, and therefore I will sign up for the donor registry. Very, very effective. So what have we learned so far about human behaviour, a subject on which we economists are now regarded as vast experts? People respond to incentives. People don't only respond to incentives. And when people are not responding to incentives, responding to something else, some other message, some other piece of persuasion, it can sometimes be hard to know exactly what they're going to do. What that tells us, I think, is that we need to keep running experiments. What David's team have been doing is to run experiment after experiment after experiment, rather than to read some book by Malcolm Gladwell and say, well, that's the thing we should use because Malcolm says it's fine. Big fan of Malcolm, by the way. You say, well, maybe this thing I read in a popular science book, or maybe this thing that I read in the literature, maybe this will work. But we can't assume it will work until we test it out, until we run the experiment and we actually see, because context can be very, very important. So a wonderful experiment that has been run not long ago by Raj Chetty, economist Raj Chetty, is to look at, well, we're saying people respond to incentives. How should those incentives be phrased? So there's a combination of the standard economic approach and the more behavioural approach. So a tax incentive or a tax on a product should make people buy less, right? The product's more expensive. Well, it turns out, if any of you have shopped in the United States, they have this infuriating thing of adding the tax on at the cash register. So you buy something, it's $9.99, you take it to the cash register and they're asking you for some reason, they $10.69 or something. Because the tax isn't actually in the label. The tax is added on later. Now, of course, everybody in the States knows this. They know they have to pay tax. They pay tax every day. They pay the sales tax. But Chetty said, well, let's just run the experiment. Let's get a supermarket to agree to have a very clear and explicit addition to the label. So we'll give you the standard price label, but there's a little addendum that says, and with tax, that will be X. And so on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, we can run it with these labels. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, we can run the experiment without the labels. We see how people respond. And it turns out that being told that the tax will be applied and what the tax will be actually has a significant impact on how much people buy. So it's not just that there's a tax incentive to buy less. It's not just that people know that there's a tax incentive to buy less, because of course they know that there's tax applied to these products. But they see the thing in front of them and they are reminded. So salience is important. And of course, this puts me in mind of smart meters. Because one of the things that one can do with smart meters is make prices very salient. And another thing that one can do with smart meters, potentially, is it allows all kinds of dynamic pricing. So we've got two very exciting things going on. The idea that you can vary prices, but this is a spike in energy demand, the price needs to go up. This is a really a low point in energy demand. Everybody should be cooling down their freezer, putting on the washing machine, putting on the dishwasher at this point. Well, we can dynamically price. We can give people an incentive to do that. But furthermore, with the smart meter, that price is salient. People really, really see the dynamic pricing if it's introduced. So that makes me quite excited about the possibility. But something else. we're running these experiments because we never really know how people are going to behave. We're running experiments, we're trying to understand human behavior. I think smart meters potentially give us a very interesting insight into human behavior because there's so much energy being generated. Let me tell you a little story, nothing to do with behavioral science, nothing to do with smart meters. It's to do with aviation. So in 1962, a British industrialist called Henry Kramer announced an aviation prize for somebody who could build a human-powered aircraft. You could fly this thing in a figure of 8, half a mile, you win a prize, and the prize was, I think, about $1 million in today's money, so it's quite a significant prize. And for nearly 2 decades, the finest aviation engineers in the world tried to win this prize, partly for the money, partly for the pride, partly because, of course, if you can make a human-powered aircraft, that means you can make a low-powered aircraft. If you can make a low-powered aircraft, it means you can maybe make a solar-powered aircraft. So it's a very interesting possibility. They just couldn't do it. It's too hard. What would happen is you'd do your best job of building this plane, you'd fly it, you'd crash it, of course, and you'd learn from your mistakes. And you've run this experiment, you flew it, you crashed it, you learned. But then it would take you months to rebuild your aircraft and to learn the lessons. And then along comes an American aviation engineer called Paul MacCready. And Paul MacCready says, you're solving the wrong problem. The problem you actually want to solve is how to run your experiment much, much faster. So MacCready designed an aeroplane that could be rebuilt after a crash within hours. So you have breakfast, you fly it, you crash it, you have lunch, they're fixing it while you're having lunch, you fly it, you crash it, you go and have supper, they fix it again, you can fly it after supper. And so you iterate, you learn incredibly quickly. And I think one of the things that David Halpern's group has pioneered in the UK is the ability to run experiments really quickly, to generate information really quickly. One of the things that I find exciting about the digital world in general and smart meters in particular is the ability to generate a tremendous amount of information in a hurry. We learn much, much faster because we're getting the information back, we're running the experiments much, much faster. And I want to conclude by reminding us that we need to keep conducting experiments because we don't fully understand human behavior, and I think we never will fully understand human behavior. We're constantly going to be surprised. So one of my heroes, the epidemiologist Archie Cochrane, who was constantly prodding, and here we are in the Wellcome collection, constantly prodding his fellow doctors to run experiments because they did not fully understand what worked and what didn't. And at one stage, Archie Cochrane ran a trial of how people should be treated after they'd had a heart attack. Should they recover at home or should they recover in specialist cardiac wings of hospitals? And it's tremendously difficult for him to get permission to run this trial because, of course, people said, this is unethical. You're going to kill people running this trial. They will die at home because they've been separated from the medical care that they require. But anyway, Archie managed to run the trial, and he gathered together some of the leading cardiac surgeons in the country after a few months, and he handed out the trial results. And he said to them, well, gentlemen, you can bet they were all gentlemen, gentlemen, you were right. So we only have the preliminary results, but it does seem as though the death rate is higher amongst the people who are recovering at home. They are safer in the hospitals. A pandemonium breaks out. Everyone's pounding the table and accusing him of being unethical, of running this dangerous trial, of killing people. So Archie lets them talk for a while. And then he says, well, it's interesting. Actually, I thought you'd say that, so I swapped the 2 columns on the data that I gave you. It turns out people are dying in your hospitals. They're safer at home. Do you want to keep running the trial until we have evidence that we can really trust? Or shall we, as you seem to want, just stop right now? You can imagine the tumbleweed blowing through the room at that point. But that was the thing that Archie was trying to get people to understand. You think you understand what's going on in the world, but the world is very complicated. The world is full of surprises. You can't just trust expertise. You have to keep running the experiments. The experiments will constantly surprise you. And when I think about smart meters, I think, first of all, of a technology that is going to allow us to vary prices dynamically. And as we saw with births and deaths, people respond to price incentives, so that's important. It's also a technology that's going to help people see the prices that they're actually facing. There's going to be transparency and clarity. And as we saw from the salience research, Raj Chetty's research in supermarkets, people respond to prices that they can see. It's going to generate a tremendous amount of information. So we'll be able to run experiments, we'll be able to learn, we'll be able to try social proof, we'll be able to try reciprocity or passive aggression, whatever it is, because we'll have the data. Because we as a policy community, the policy wonks, we are going to learn very, very quickly. And more importantly, households, families, they are also going to learn what helps them, how they can save money. And I think some of the things that we learn are going to surprise us. Thank you very much.